Hey there, European history students. We're back again today with our fifth essential question for period one. So let's not dilly-dally and let's get into it. So how did capitalism and the persistence of earlier structures shape family life and traditional ideas in the 15th and 16th century? So remember, when we're talking about earlier structures, we're thinking subsistence agriculture, which was the idea that you only produce enough for your family and you produce little to no more. We also have the idea of the feudal system and then the idea of indentured servitude. So let's not dilly dally and let's really get into this. Let's start to dig deep on farming. So farming is a big part of this essential question. So when we're talking about farming, we're really just focusing on peasants because peasants really were the ones who expected to farm. And if you were a lord, you did not need to farm because you had enough money to pay someone else to do it for you. So peasant life was based around farming, and bad harvests were life threatening because if you did not have a good harvest, you could either not feed your family, or you could not pay the lord rent, and then you would have no farm and you would have no house, and then your family would be destitute. And although serfdom was on a decline, it still existed in Europe. And remember from last week or last episode, we were talking about it being very, very still active in Eastern Europe. So we're thinking the Slavic areas and Russia or the Balkans. Farming went from subsistence to commercial farming with the advent of new technologies, new ways to irrigate, new ways to keep your soil healthy. And soil health is so very important to farming. And we'll get into how soil health plays into the growth of crops and the productivity of a farm. So some ecological disasters, these are just things that you just can't do anything about. And if they happen, then you're almost plumb out of luck if they happen, because things like the Little Ice Age were devastating because you have these lower than average temperatures in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. And when you have lower than average temperatures, your plants aren't used to that. They don't know how to react, so they end up dying. And this had disastrous effects on crops and European farmers, especially around 1650, which is right at the end of period one, but we'll pick back up on it in period two, although the little ice ages were common from 1300 to 1800, so the 14th to 19th century. So a new form of farming that we just talked about, or that we just brought up, was the new field system, or the open field system, pardon me, which was an agricultural system in which portions of land were divided into strips that families could rent out for themselves. And these areas had large plots and many rows for many people to rent out. And they also had common areas so that you could bring your cattle or bring your chickens or bring whatever you want, and you could feed them in common meadows, these little grazing areas that were provided for your courtesy, so that you could do your planting and you could feed your livestock, so you weren't just having vegetables to eat. So the system did not encourage soil rotation, which led to quick soil exhaustion. So let's talk about a method that does include soil rotation, which was known as the three fields method, or the three field system, and was used to keep crops healthy and soil nutrient rich. So let's say this is barley, this is field one, this is wheat, this is field two, and this is a meadow, this is field three. So say we're in year one. So year one, we have barley in one, wheat in two, meadow in three. Year two, we're gonna move the meadow to one, we're gonna move the barley to two, and we're gonna move the wheat to three, so that now field one has a time to rest. And then year two, our meadow is going to go to field two, our barley is going to go to field three, and our wheat is going to go to field three. I'm sorry, our wheat is going to go to field one, and our barley is going to go to field two. So now that, pardon me, this is very tongue twisting to say. So now this plot has a chance to rest and recover. And soil always needs time to rest and recover. And this is also called crop rotation, or just polycropping, which keeps soil healthy because you're not having one plant exhaust the nutrients. You're having multiple plants cycle through and take different nutrients out so that the soil isn't deprived of just one nutrient. So this kept crops very healthy and led to much higher yields. Another form of farming was the enclosure system, which involved consolidating strips of land from, say, the open field system and forming them into land plots that peasants could rent out or buy by buying the land title. Peasants did not like the system because it favored nobility and was just a cash grab, and peasants had a hard time affording land, whereas they could just rent out a little piece of land that they could just make enough food for themselves and their family, and everything was set. But peasants definitely disputed this one. even though it was very profitable for European landlords, and it had a high productivity and a positive effect on landlords, and it caused peasants to sink deeper into poverty. And this caused them to move to cities. So if you couldn't afford a farm in a rural area, you would go to the city to find a job. And in the city, you would have other people from the rural areas making the food for you, growing it themselves. Those who could afford enclosure plots, those who could afford land titles, they were making your food, and you'd get a job and then use your wages to buy food from them. So it all works out, and everyone is supporting the economy. And this is, again, why we're having more people move to urban areas and cities. So some major cities that we talked about last week were Genoa, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London. Those are some major economic powerhouses with a lot of commerce happening. So the increased movement to cities led to rapid industrialization in Europe during this period. Let's talk about the family. What's life like for a typical 15th century, 16th century European family? Well, laws determine the legitimacy of marriage. So if your marriage was not within the confines of a law, it was not legitimate and you were not married. Laws also forbade interclass marriage. So say a high nobility from the Medici family could not marry a peasant. You just couldn't. The laws forbade it. Governments also offered fiscal incentives for families that had more children because you wanted to have a lot more children, especially in the 15th century after Europe is trying to recuperate its 33% loss of total population from the Black Death, because you really want to bring European population back up to where it was, because you have a lot missing and your economy definitely suffers if you lose 1/3 of your total population. Younger sons were expected to become clergymen and artisans after their father died, although after the Protestant Reformation, many became artisans, and being a clergyman was seen as not as desirable. And when the head of the household died, when the father died in a family, their eldest son inherited their land. So the patriarchal system is the idea that men run society. And as we know, in this period, women are being subjugated. Women do not have as much rights as men do, or any at all. And people are being ruled by the monarchy, which was usually ruled by a king and sometimes a queen who really did not have any power. So the patriarchal system was ingrained in European society, given that monarchies were very common. So women in the 16th century, let's talk about them. So women only had claims to their dowry, which was granted upon them only after marriage. And women were also able to choose who the dowry went to upon their death. And in any domestic situation, when we talk about a household and keeping it functioning, both a man and his wife needed to contribute to make sure that the household was functioning. And convents were these places where nuns worshipped and nuns spent their lives. So a woman could dedicate her life to Christ, and then she would have a chance to read, write, and study. But the Reformation led to a decline in popularity for this path, much as it did for young men. So women in education. In the 16th century, some French philosophers put up an argument: should women attend college? And one side of the argument stated that women were naturally inferior to men and thus should not be educated on such a high level. And while the other side of this argument, it stated that men oppressed women in order to maintain a social status, and women's inferiority, quote unquote, was caused by a lack of education. So if women were educated, they would be on the same par as men. And this social idea that women are automatically lower is just a social construct that men have made up in order to keep themselves on top. So religion and the family, we know that Christianity dominated Europe, whether it be Catholicism, Judaism, Catholicism, being a Jesuit, being a Lutheran, being a Calvinist. We all know a bunch of religions popped up around this time, all different sects of Christianity. We really would not have a lot of religious diversity or tolerance other than Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So let's talk about what a child life was like. Well, children were seen as small adults, and this was because we do not have a lot of knowledge on early education and early childhood development. So we didn't know that children needed lots of love and care and attention, and they needed some mental stimulation, and they need a lot of social interactions in order to build up their cognitive being. We didn't know this, so we just put children straight to work because they needed to help provide for the family, and they were just little adults and they could do anything a regular adult could, so why not put them to work, right? So children were expected to be in shops, be in farms, because most children were not in school, because most children, especially if you were poor, did not have access to education. And it wouldn't be until around the 18th century where education would become a standard in most countries, no matter what your social or economic status was. So the Black Death left Europe in a need for a population rejuvenation. And this is why we're having more states encourage the birth of children. Although the Little Ice Age led to farming families having less children, because if you were still a subsistence farmer and you had little crop yields because of the Little Ice Age, because of the cold temperatures, you really did not want to have another mouth to feed. So some farming families did not have more children due to the lack of crops coming in and due to the lack of profits and due to the lack of just money overall, because you weren't having enough crops to sell. Let's talk about childbirth and how that played in Europe. So the 16th century saw Europe having a low rate of live births and a high rate of infant mortality, and infant mortality is just the rates that infants die. Women were marrying a little later in life, and remember that life expectancy is not what it was today. It was probably around 40, maybe 50. I encourage you to look that up. That's some knowledge I don't know, so I encourage you to look that up, find out for yourself. It might be a little interesting for you to find out. A lack of medical knowledge led to high miscarriages and stillbirth rates, and harsh working conditions strained women's body so that these rates went even higher. So early family planning, some early forms of birth control in Europe were abstinence until marriage, herb-based medications, and then after childbirth, you would have a 6-month period where you just would not get pregnant, and the body was almost recuperating to get ready for another child. So what's life look like inside a European house? Well, houses went from being multi-generational, so having 1, 2, 3 generations in one house, to being more nuclear. And the idea of a nuclear family or nuclear household is when you have both parents and between 2 to 3 children, and that is it. That is your household. That is all that exists. So the early modern festivals, let's talk about some culture. Carnivals and folk festivals were a way to bring local communities together. And especially after a very high yield and a high and profitable harvest, farmers would often have festivals to celebrate. Although the Reformation led to a decrease in religious folk festivals, other folk festivals and carnivals still persisted because it was a fun way for Europeans to enjoy themselves and a fun way for peasants to entertain themselves. So let's talk about some other entertainment. In Europe, blood sports were a common form of entertainment, and this usually saw 2 people fighting against each other in a sport like jousting, sometimes to the death. Blood sports also involved animals like wolves, dogs, and bears, which were also popular for Europeans. We see here a bear and some dogs, and then we have an audience. Fine arts were also popular if you were rich enough to commission art, or if you were rich enough to go to a gallery or a salon. So let's talk about some cultural beliefs. The Reformation led to people thinking more critically and more worldly and more sensitively about the world around them, and not necessarily more secularly, but a little bit more open-minded, because Martin Luther was able to open their eyes up a little bit more to the injustices that the Catholic Church was bringing to them. So traditional beliefs were not as important. So people began to stop believing in the physical manifestation of the devil, and some felt freed from evil when they embraced this idea. So we're moving away from traditional ideas of evil into more ideas of spirituality and being more forgiving and being a better person and not having the weight of an evil being holding you down. So our last slide, witchcraft. The Reformation also led to an increased number of witch accusations. So we know that in Salem in the 17th century, we had a lot of witchcraft trials, but in Europe, we started it. We started here in Europe. So women were being accused of witches when disputes arose around money or land. And most of the people who were accusing these women of witchcraft were other women. So women did most of the accusing, and beggars were most frequently accused, because beggars were not only seen as lower life people, but sometimes they were ill, sometimes they were sick, they were dirty, they were wearing shabby clothes. And when you see someone with shabby clothes, long shaggy hair, injured or disfigured in some way, you would automatically think they're a witch, especially if they're asking you for money. England, France, and Ireland did not really participate in the witch hunts, but the German states had a high rate of witch hunts and a high rate of witch sightings and deaths. So let's talk about our actual question again: how did capitalism and the persistence of earlier structures shape family life and ideas during the 15th and 16th century? Well, capitalism combined with the earlier structure of farming to bring this new commercial agricultural revolution. So we're having a lot more food being produced, and it's being produced in a much more healthy way for the environment. So we're having farming become this idea of more bang for your buck. So you have healthier soils in some areas, and you also have more availability for farmers to rent out plots and to provide for their families. And we have events like the Little Ice Age that would dampen crop yields if they happened. And this was a period between 1300 and 1800 with a peak at 1650 of lower crop yields due to a lower average temperature, and that killed the crops. The enclosure movement was the idea of consolidating strips of land from the open field system and slapping land titles on them. This was not popular with peasants, but was very popular with nobility, and this caused people to move from rural areas to urban areas in search for jobs, leading to high industrialization in Europe. Governments offered fiscal incentives for more children, and especially after the Black Death, people wanted to have more children in order to bring up the population, although the Little Ice Age made some areas a little bit more difficult because you did not have enough capital and did not have enough food to have enough children or to have more children. The patriarchy existed, which was the idea that men rule society. Women did not have a very big place in society, and the only place that they could have a voice was a convent. There was also the idea in France that women should attend college. Both sides were highly contested, and Christianity was always in the home. Children were seen as tiny adults and were not treated as they should be. And many children went homeless, and many children went abandoned because I believe it's either later in this period or next period, we're going to talk about what being a young woman in Europe was like, and what your options were, and what it's like to be courted by a man, and what it's like to have a child before marriage, what your options are, and what life would be like for you. So that's what life is like for children. Some were abandoned, and not many were educated. A lack of medical knowledge led to high miscarriages and stillbirth rates. And since women were put in such harsh conditions, their bodies were often not ready for a child, and led to, again, high miscarriages and stillbirth rates. Family planning, aka birth control, really was not all that effective because you had abstinence until marriage, herb-based medications, and then natural birth control. The idea of the nuclear household became popular, and folk festivals and blood sports were highly popular forms of entertainment, with people thinking a little bit more openly about religion and a little bit more openly about the world, and them being freed of their worldly fears because the idea of the physical devil was not a thing. And many people are being accused of witchcraft in Germany, and not so much in England, France, and Ireland. So I hope that answered our question. Always, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. And remember, folks, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we will see you in the next one. That is all.